Hello and welcome to Science Fiction 101, episode 13, the episode where everything goes wrong. We had all sorts of technical issues with this recording, so we apologise for any pops, scratches, and the occasional bit where we sound as if we're reading. Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
We're recording this in December 2021, and we're going to read a special Christmas edition of a science fiction magazine. But it's not from this year, it's from 70 years ago. So, as we promised last time, we're going to be looking at the December 1951 edition of Galaxy Science Fiction magazine. Now, before we go any further, I will say that this was published long before either I or Colin were born. So, Colin, have you managed to read the whole magazine?
I did, cover to cover.
And what was your overall impression of it?
I enjoyed a lot of the stories. And the illustrations were cool. I love the ads, and I was particularly intrigued by that one page where you can buy a whole bunch of science fiction novels for $1.99 or $2.99 each. I almost convinced myself this time to print it off and send it in, just to see what would happen with it.
If you were in, let's say, a Jack Finney story, if you did that, you'd find that you would actually get a response. And you'd somehow find yourself transferred back in time to the 1950s. So it might be worth doing it just so you can actually see what happens in real life. Just so that people know, this issue of Galaxy, December 1951, is online. You can go to the Internet Archive and we'll give you a link on our website. And you simply click on the link and you can view the entire issue. So somebody has scanned the whole thing, and it's there in various formats. You can read it on the screen, you can download it and view it on various devices depending on which format suits you.
I prefer reading text, and that way I can search it and annotate it. And so I actually took these scans and I ran them through an image extractor to get them out of the PDF, and then run it through an optical character recognition system, and then spent about 2 days cleaning up the resulting EPUB.
Wow. There's dedication for you. What I did was, one of the file formats that they have is the CBR format, so-called, which is it's a zip file, or a RAR file, RAR, and within it are JPEGs of all the individual pages. And with a suitable piece of free software, you can just download the CBR file, and you can just flip from page to page. So that's what I've been doing. But I think it's good in any format you can make use of, basically. And what we're going to do then is try to go through the magazine almost page by page. We won't do every single page because that would be very, very tedious. And if you haven't actually read the magazine yet, I think we'll give you enough information that you'll get a good sense of what it's all about. And there might be some spoilers here. But perhaps if you have managed to read the magazine yourself, some things that we say may resonate with you, and you might have different opinions to us. And of course, we'd love to hear your reactions, so do let us know after the event. But we'll go through it as if we just picked this magazine up on the newsstand, I think. And it begins with a very nice painting on the front cover by the artist Emsch, whose real name was Ed Emschwiller. And it's sort of a Christmas scene. How would you describe that scene, Colin?
I would say that we're in a somewhat upscale restaurant on a distant planet where Santa is enjoying a wonderful set of drinks with aliens and Earthlings.
Indeed, and it's certainly very curious about Santa. He is clearly an alien because he's got 4 arms as well as 2 legs.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
Yeah. So he's got 2 hands clasped together across his belly, and then he's got another arm that's holding a drink, and the other arm is holding something that he's being given by the waiter. On the inside of the magazine is a poster or an ad for a film, When Worlds Collide. Do you know that film, Colin?
I do. That used to be shown on our local television station when I was growing up.
Terrific. And of course it's a George Powell film. George Powell was active through, I think, the 1940s, the 50s, the 60s and into the 70s. But he certainly made his big breakthrough in the 50s with films like Destination Moon, When Worlds Collide, War of the Worlds, and so on. Anyway, the ad says, "When worlds collide, spectacle never before filmed, giant planet collides with Earth, enormous earthquakes swallowing whole continents," and so on and so on. So it really was the disaster movie to end all disaster movies. But I think this was before there even was such a thing as disaster movies, I think, from what I remember of the film. But it's great to see it advertised here in this magazine. It came out, according to my research, on the 15th of November 1951. And here it is in the December 1951 issue of Galaxy. So it's great that the magazine was able to advertise a current science fiction film. Next thing in the magazine is the table of contents, which lists all the stories, and then comes an editorial by the editor of the magazine. And what I found interesting here is at this point in Galaxy's existence, it had been running for just over a year. So I think it said this was the 14th issue in total, and they were just about to change publishers because there'd been some trouble with the original publisher. And the editorial says, I've got a little quote here, "Being unfamiliar with science fiction, the previous publishers were unable to integrate the magazine into their publishing program." And if you look it up on Wikipedia, there's an explanation there that there was some kind of sabotage of the distribution by the old publisher, which is quite astonishing, really. What did you make of that editorial, Colin?
Well, I looked at it as more of like an introduction to the magazine. They're talking about which stories are going to be publishing in the near future. Hey, we're going to be publishing all these great things by people you don't know yet, but you will soon.
It refers to a list of stories they've got, and it says all of these stories are signed up for book publication. And then there's another list for another issue, and it says all of these will also be in book form. So it's a magazine which is publishing original science fiction shorts, but many of these have been snapped up by book publishers. So they're going to appear in short story anthologies or short story collections from individual authors. So yeah, they're really picking up on how important this magazine is, that it's got all of these stories which are somehow part of the zeitgeist. And I think that's an astonishing editorial in that respect. And with the editor, Horace Gold, saying, "We're proud of it," you know. So this is a magazine that has some confidence in itself.
So where does Galaxy fall in line with things like Astounding and Asimov's?
Astounding, I think, began in the 1930s. At some point, Astounding came under the editorship of John W. Campbell, and that's when it really became the dominant science fiction magazine. So that, I think, was 1938. And there were all sorts of magazines around at that time, but Astounding stood out from the rest because it had a clear science policy, if you like, of what science fiction should be in relation to science. So Astounding dominated the 1940s, and Galaxy then comes along in the 50s. Astounding continues, by the way. Astounding is still published today. It underwent a change of name. It became Analog. Whereas Galaxy came along in 1950, 51, stuck around maybe 15, 20 years, something like that. And I think it went out of existence and then was brought back by a different publisher and then disappeared again. So it had a bit of a wobbly existence at the end. More or less in parallel with Galaxy, along comes the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which does survive to this day. Asimov's came in the late 70s and, again, obviously is stuck around to the present day. My sense is that every genre used to have fiction magazines, so there were lots of detective magazines, lots of Western magazines, science fiction, horror, fantasy, all of those. Most of the other genres kind of dropped away and stopped having magazines, or maybe just went down to one magazine or something. But science fiction always somehow managed to carry on the magazine tradition.
So I always wonder why science fiction gets short shrift. It's not often works of science fiction that get considered literature. Science fiction movies and shows aren't often considered for awards. Authors object to a lot of their work being defined as science fiction, and that's been going on for decades. And I wonder if there's a stigma about the short story format or being published in magazines versus published in books.
I think there's a bit of all of that going on. If you think about the history of science fiction from the point of view of the UK, well, we had H.G. Wells, we had Mary Shelley. We saw the birth of science fiction within literature. And so we have that kind of literary strand of science fiction which continues through to this day. But in the US, you had the intervention of the popular media, i.e. magazines and comic books. And so seen from this side of the Atlantic, it's as if science fiction splits around, I suppose, about the 1920s. You've got the literary tradition, which continues in the UK, but then you've got this very popular branch of science fiction, which is what became American science fiction. And now at some point, they kind of converge again, and the quality of the writing goes up in the American magazines, and you kind of get some very interesting things happening in the 60s. But yeah, there's all sorts of snobbery and snobbishness throughout the whole history of the field. And I think we might get an indication of some of that as we go through the stories in the magazine. World Without Children by Damon Knight. Damon Knight is quite a well-known author and editor, and he was also a critic. But at this point of his career, according to what I looked up in the science fiction encyclopedia, he was really just beginning a run of his very best short fiction. So he was mostly known for short fiction rather than novels. And he did win awards for his critical writing and for some of his short stories as well. And from the mid-1960s onwards, he edited a successful series of original anthologies called Orbit. So Damon Knight was a really significant figure in the field in this era. Less well known today, I think because he probably doesn't have a classic novel to his name.
I think I first heard of him really only within the last couple of years. We did the Cold Equations on my other podcast over the summer, and he objected to that story so strongly that he wrote a rebuttal with multiple ways that they could have saved that young lady's life.
Yes, he was very critical of that, and he was also quite critical of some of the famous authors around at the time. And I was just trying to think of his short stories. He wrote that short story that was on The Twilight Zone. The punchline of the story is, it's a cookbook.
To serve man.
Yes, he wrote that story. Whether he would like that or not, that is probably his legacy. So, Colin, what did you think of the story World Without Children by Damon Knight?
I enjoyed the story. It reminded me of almost like an action movie. There's a lot of things that happen. There's some discussion of sociology and what's going on in the culture right now. But there's a lot of, he ran out, he jumped into the helicopter, he slid down the line, he rescued his friend, he infiltrated the party looking for support for his projects.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. I made a little note. I wrote, I couldn't follow the plot, but lots of running around with helicopters and faxes. Oh, and I also wrote, feminism is mentioned. And I can't quite remember where that comes up, but that sort of leapt out of the page at me, that in a popular magazine in 1951, somebody might know what feminism was. If you had to summarise the story in terms of the plot, are you able to do that? Because I found it started off being one thing and then it kind of turned into something else.
Yeah, well, the premise of the story is that humans have invented a way to become virtually immortal to extend the human lifespan thousands of years. And there's a little bit of discussion early in the story about how society has changed. There's been an agreement that they will stop having kids because otherwise you introduce this population problem if people aren't dying at almost the same rate that they're being born. And then there's this twist that comes in that not only have people agreed to stop having kids, but humans are now beginning to be unable to have kids, which means the end of the human race. And there's a small group of people who take it upon themselves to try and educate the population about this. And then the government sees that as a threat to their control of the population, and so they're going to try and squash them.
It seems to me that although it's a short story, well, technically it might be a novelette or something. It feels like it's got a whole novel's worth of material that's been crammed into this piece of short fiction. Did you feel that, or is that just me?
It felt a little long in some places. I think it could have been condensed and been a little more impactful.
I've written down here that, yes, humans are becoming infertile, but other aspects of immortality are touched on. There's a speculation or a claim by one of the characters that monogamy might be impossible in this world. And there was an observation that if we have immortality, the great artists like Picasso might live forever. And how would that affect our culture? We're used to artists having a brief existence, and if they live forever, how will that change things now? But I don't think it provides answers to any of those things. It just throws them up as little ideas. And there's also, is it a character who says he's giving up smoking?
Oh, right off the bat. George, right?
That's one of those things that made me think, oh, so early. This is 1951. I didn't know that smoking was considered to be bad for people at that point. I don't think the link with cancer was proven until the 1960s or thereabouts.
I took that as just in stride because that's the way our culture is right here.
I gather that the story's been anthologized quite a few times over the years. Obviously, some people rate the story quite highly. I thought it started off well, but then by the end of it, I thought, oh, this is a bit boring.
Yeah, the point where I started to struggle with it was when he went to the party and everyone was arguing that their individual cause was the most important thing that should be funded by all these underground sources. It's literature, it's preserving birds, it's this, it's that, it's the extinction of the human species. They were all just kind of equated at the same level. At that point, I'm thinking, are these all really all equally important? And I don't know.
What I felt was interesting, though, is it didn't feel quite as clunky as some of the science fiction from the 40s that I've read. And therefore, it did feel like a 1950s story. And the fact that it wasn't dealing with hardware, but it was dealing more with social implications of scientifically based choices that people might make, it did feel that this was a post-war story rather than a pre-war story. Shall we move on to the next item?
Yes. This would be A Pail of Air by Fritz Leiber.
At this point in his career, Leiber was a well-established short story writer and novelist, and he would go on to win Hugo Awards in 1958 for The Big Time and 1964 for The Wanderer, and he won both Hugo and Nebula Awards for short fiction in the 1970s.
I think this was my favorite story from this whole selection of stories. It goes from being very dark and wondering about the survival of the human species to learning of the main character is 10 years old and that there's other survivors of the catastrophe that's happened. I thought it was interesting that the inside of this cover was When Worlds Collide, and this story is about the Earth being cherry-picked by a dark star and being pulled away from the Earth with all the resultant issues that come about.
And I'd kind of forgotten that aspect of it because it is told through the eyes, basically, of this 10-year-old. I don't remember the bigger picture of what was happening that caused the Earth to become this way. I just remember the experiencing of it. We start on this kind of frozen world. People are living inside buildings, but they've built up these layer upon layer upon layer of blankets to keep the warmth in, and they need to go and collect air. That the world is so cold that the oxygen has frozen out, and you have to go outside, dig up some of the frozen oxygen, bring it in a bucket, and then of course as it warms up, oxygen is released for you to breathe. And it's such an outlandish concept in a way, and yet very convincing.
There's a quote that I pulled out of it to show just how good Lieber's writing is and to talk about what his father is teaching his son. And it goes like this. You know that game we sometimes play sitting in a square in the nest tossing a ball around? Courage is like a ball, son. A person can hold it only so long, and then he's got to toss it to someone else. When it's tossed your way, you've got to catch it and hold it tight and hope there will be someone else to toss it to when you get tired of being brave.
Really nice. And it's told from the point of view of this one small family unit. And I think that's what makes the story work. It is about a global event in a way, but it is told entirely through the experience of this small group of people, these survivors. And I've seen some criticism of the story, which is largely around the scientific inaccuracy of the story. But I wasn't at all bothered by that because it seemed plausible in the moment. And in particular, he describes a kind of layering of the atmosphere, because basically the Earth has become so cold that all the gases have frozen in the atmosphere and then sort of layered themselves onto the surface of the Earth. So if you want a particular gas, you dig down to the right level and there's the gas that you want. Leiber even describes it as being, or one of the characters mentions a pousse café. And I thought, what the hell is that? So I had to go and look it up. And it's a layered drink. It's a kind of a cocktail where you get different types of alcohol and you pour them very carefully, one on top of the other in the glass. And because the alcohols are different, they float at different levels. So you get this kind of layered effect. And it's such a beautiful metaphor.
It pulled me out as soon as I read that because I immediately went to Apollo 1, the one that had the launch pad fire because they were breathing a pure oxygen atmosphere and there was a spark. So that pulled me out. And then I stuck my nose back and kept reading. But there was so much about trying to preserve the species and preserve who we are and what we know. And
then, of course, at the end, there's a kind of this is where the spoiler comes in. It's kind of a Deus Ex Machina thing where I think it's scientists from Los Alamos or something turn up, and that, to me, that changed the tone of the story somewhat, and I was less happy with it at that point. But I think it had won me over enough in the earlier part of the story that I'm willing to forgive almost anything that's wrong with the story.
The little boy goes outside to get literally a pail of air, and he sees a woman in another building. And they are this little family. The boy, the girl, the mom, and the dad. They're the only known survivors that they know of. And so, as the reader, I'm wondering, is he hallucinating? Or has someone or something found them? Why is the Earth like this? And that's all mixed together. And then it gets pulled out to where, the scientists from Los Alamos have reestablished what's in essence now just a colony on the Earth. And it's being torn away from their solar system. And they're using nuclear energy, and they use that energy to heat themselves and grow things. And they have lots and lots of fuel nowadays because there's tons of hydrogen and oxygen around.
Science fiction seems to have this kind of dividing line around 1945 and the exploding of the atomic bombs. Science fiction before that really was one thing, and science fiction after that has to be something else, because it has to take notice of the fact that we are now living in an atomic age, which is what science fiction had always speculated about, but now it's real, and now it's killed people, and now it's capable of providing limitless energy. And I think we see that in some of the other stories in this magazine as well. The next story is With These Hands, which is by C.M. Kornbluth. And the sort of background to Cyril Kornbluth is that he was just 28 years old when this story was published, but he'd been publishing since he was 15. So he was already a seasoned science fiction writer. And the very following year to this, 1952, he published 3 novels in 1 year. And in 1953, he wrote what is probably his classic, The Space Merchants, which is a collaboration with Frederik Pohl. And that's a classic of satirical science fiction. So this is one of the things we say about the 1950s, is that it took a very satirical and sociological turn in science fiction. Kornbluth died very young as well. He died in 1958, aged only 34. So he didn't really live to see the longevity of his success. What did you think of With These Hands?
This story was the most impactful personally to me out of anything that I read out of this magazine. I'm a musician. I play tuba and I play classical music. And in our society today, there is this new electronic music phenomenon going on. And for people that play classical music, we have lost a lot of opportunities to perform because culturally it's not as popular as it used to be. And a lot of other people are using electronics to make movie scores and other things instead. And so to see this artist whose whole way of life and way to support himself is being replaced by, what was the acronym? The SPG, the stereo pantograph. It's like my tuba has been replaced by a synthesizer.
It's interesting that you make that parallel, because I was just reading, well, I say just, I give the story a lot of credit for this, but I was reading this stereo pantograph as being what nowadays we would call 3D printing.
Oh, totally.
Because that's essentially what it is, isn't it? But you're absolutely right. This is really what happens when a technology is able to mimic what previously was the domain of an artist. And one of the nice features of the story, it doesn't just talk about this stereo pantograph as being a means of making perfect reproductions of things. It also couples with a thing which he calls the aestheticon. For example, if you want to make a sculpture, you can dial in these settings to make a brawny sculpture, or a sculptor figure who looks determined. So, I mean, obviously nowadays we use software for this. It's not just a machine that makes things. It has these aesthetic controls that allows you to create these pseudo works of art. I thought that was fascinating.
We're getting close to that now. There are sites for people to play role-playing games where you can take a base 3D sculpture and customize it and have it printed so that you can put it on your table in the middle of your dungeon campaign or your war and move it around and represent yourself with it. But yeah, it's fully personalized.
There's a famous theoretical work by Walter Benjamin, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And this was one of the first sort of philosophical explorations of what becomes of art when technology can do the things that artists normally do. It's a big issue that Kornbluth is dealing with here, and he does it through this quite simple dramatization. So I was quite taken with the story. I think it feels quite dated, but it's obviously dealing with something that is very resonant with today's world.
Well, and at some point, the ability of machines to reproduce art and the ability of machines to reproduce work is going to have larger societal implications.
What about the next story, Winner Lose All? This is by Jack Vance. Jack Vance, of course, lived for a very long time. He was born in 1916. And he died just a few years ago. He began publishing in 1945, and he was a colossally prolific author. I've got him down as writing something like 60 to 90 books, and had a number of awards to his name as well. So in the 1960s, he picked up a couple of Hugo Awards. There's another one in 2010, and a Nebula Award in 1967. And of course, the Hugos are given by fans. Nebulas are given by professional writers, so Vance very much a solid writer in the field.
That's a rare thing.
It is indeed. Winner Lose All. This is another one that barely made an impression on me. I read this one about 3 weeks ago, and I made notes. What I've got here is if you look at the physical descriptions of characters in the second paragraph of the story, it's pure pulp. So this is the second paragraph. It says, Avery was thin, hawk-nosed. His complexion was sallow leather colour, his hair lank and sparse. He had black eyes between narrow lids, and the angle at which they crossed his cheeks gave his face a look of clownish melancholy. Dart was stocky, stub-featured. His hair was Airedale red. He was abrupt and positive in his movements, stretching with a quick, wide sweep of short arms. He joined Avery by the forward cupola. And this is a bit like when we were reviewing the Chris Hadfield novel a few episodes ago. I picked up on certain habits that Hadfield had when he was describing people. And I think Hadfield got his ability to detail character from Jack Vance, because that's exactly what Vance is doing here. He's describing these physical characteristics which are not at all important. Now, I appreciate this is a style, and it was a very prevalent style at one point, but it just makes the story feel very, very old-fashioned to have that kind of descriptive detail. I'd rather know what the character's doing. I don't really care what shape their nose is. Certainly as it begins, it feels like space opera. Curiously, it had a number of things in it that made me think, oh, this is a bit Star Trek. So there's a spaceship with a bridge. He talks about travelling in macroid space, which you, as a reader, you just assume, oh, well, that's kind of hyperspace or subspace. Then there was an alien called Unigen, and it's some kind of energy/matter being. And again, this made me think of original Star Trek. You know, you often saw that kind of alien on there. And there was lots of technobabble in this story as well. And then they go down to a planet, and there's some searching for uranium, and then that made me think, oh, okay, maybe it is a post-war story then, because he knows about uranium. I've got a note here that the experiences of the Unigen are told in parallel to the experiences of our astronaut heroes, and the two life forms seem to be operating in complete ignorance of each other. So they're both there in the same place, both exploring the same territory, but they don't interact, they don't know each other is there. That felt quite Star Trek-y to me, which is a plus, I think. But the rest of it, I don't remember at all. It made very little impression on me.
Yeah, the story aims at the single point of interaction where there are 3 humans down on the planet, and the Unigen has sent one of its nodes to go explore this. The humans think the node is an insect, some kind of a light, and the Unigen recognizes the humans, but thinks that they might be a threat.
Oh, yes. Yes, I'd forgotten that.
There's a big misunderstanding, and no one ends up getting the uranium because they both leave. And I immediately went to Invasion of the Body Snatchers because of the way it talks about the way the spores spread out into space looking for more uranium to colonize and then grow on end.
And, of course, that's from a similar era, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or the novel. The Body Snatchers is from the same decade. So, again, ideas that are very much in the air around this time. And then we get to an ad. It's for science and fantasy fiction books from Stevens Book Service of New York. And they say they have various anthologies, around $3 each, and 40-odd novels. And then they have a list of authors. You can get books by Asimov, Wyndham, Bradbury, Frederick Brown, John W. Campbell, L. Sprague de Camp, Robert Heinlein, Robert E. Howard, L. Ron Hubbard, Raymond F. Jones, and Arthur C. Clarke, plus some others. And some of the other authors, I thought, I wonder why these aren't remembered today. So all those famous names, but then you get Robert S. Carr, I thought, never heard of them, Theodora Dubois, and you think, what makes some authors survive and some not? Obviously, the quality of the work, hopefully, is a major factor in that. But other authors just disappear. I looked up Theodora Dubois because I'd never heard of Theodora. And she was born in 1890. So in 1951, when this advert appeared, she would have been 61 at that point. She was quite an established science fiction author, and apparently she committed something of a no-no in 1954. She published a story called Seeing Red, which was critical of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and her publisher dropped her. So that might be why we don't hear of Theodora Dubois anymore. She damaged her career at the end, unfortunately, by sticking up for freedom of speech and all that, which is a shame.
Yeah, it is.
Then there's a coupon for subscribing to Galaxy. You can get a whole year of Galaxy magazine for $3.25. All you have to do is cut out the coupon. And then it goes to the book reviews. Galaxy's 5-star shelf, and this has a book review by Robert Heinlein. So, he's writing the review, and he's reviewing a book called Space Medicine, the Human Factor in Flights Beyond the Earth. And what's interesting in the book review, Heinlein recognises that there's been a shift from the nerdy believers in spaceflight who had always been reading science fiction and buying science fiction magazines. There was a shift from those to the respectable citizens who in the 1950s were coming along and actually studying spaceflight and its implications. And suddenly it was becoming real. And of course that would lead eventually to Sputnik and the manned spaceflight programs at the end of the 1950s. So it's an interesting little moment in time. And then there's a couple of book reviews by Groff Conklin, who himself was an editor and anthologist. So again, quite an influential figure back in the day. There's an ad for next month's issue, which forefronts The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. Now that's a book that's survived through to this day, and was in fact the first ever winner of a Hugo Award in 1953. So not this issue of Galaxy, but the very next one would contain the first part of that. And then there's a full-page ad for Slan. Have you ever read Slan?
I have not.
So Slan was a novel by A.E. Van Vogt, who was, again, a big-name author back in the day. Not so well known today. I think he's kind of slipped a bit. But a very influential author. He influenced a lot of writers, as well as being a highly regarded writer in his day. And this full-page advert is from Simon & Schuster, who's basically saying, if you send us $2.50 plus postage, we'll send you the book. And it's very rare, so you probably want to buy this. It may go out of print, is basically what they're saying, which isn't true, because it stayed in print until at least 2012. The next story is Not a Creature Was Stirring by Dean Evans, which Galaxy has, after the title, has a little blurb, and it simply says, this could be a Christmas story, even though it doesn't begin like a Christmas story at all.
That was a bit of a slog for me. I was trying to draw something from this, and so here's this very taciturn man who comes out of his gold mine to find out that humans have finally succeeded in killing themselves off, which I think is a response to the nuclear weapons that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And so he wanders around Nevada, several places, just doing things, not really having a purpose, trying to fill time, and then realizes that it's Christmas Eve and he ends up at a church.
What did you think of that ending?
Well, as a Christian, the character in the story did not seem to evince a very strong faith in God, and now at the end of all things, he seems to be a little more motivated, perhaps. Like he goes to a church looking for salvation or help or companionship or something. He's probably not going to get it because there's no love in there, but yeah, it's just kind of left me wondering what it was. It was a vignette, and you get to go along with the character as he goes through it all.
Dean Evans, of all the authors in this issue of Galaxy, Dean Evans seems to be the least known. I looked him up. There's no Wikipedia page for him. He isn't mentioned on the Science Fiction Encyclopedia. The Internet Speculative Fiction Database gives him just a handful of published works. I think there's 5 short stories or something like that. So this is somebody who doesn't really have much of an existence. And I think I can see why. I don't think this is a great story. Although the descriptions are quite good. I think it's quite vivid when we're with him going through these different places trying to figure out what's going on. And he encounters these various tableaus where when the catastrophe, whatever it is, happened, people were sort of caught in various places, so he sees somebody standing in a doorway and he assumes they're alive, but of course they're not. He sees somebody standing at a bar, he sees somebody sitting in a car. So he sees these sort of normal situations, but they are almost like a frozen moment. But then when you get to the end of the story, it's as if the author knew that he had to have an ending by page 7 and just made one up.
There's only so much of that vignette that you're going to take as a reader. So if you want to experience the loneliness and the despair and, the futile attempts of a man to be completely alone, I think it's a good read. Much beyond that, I don't know. Although I will say that all of his works seem to be up on Gutenberg.
Ah, yes. Oh, that's useful. Then there is an ad on how to earn money writing short stories, mysteries, articles from the Palmer Institute of Authorship. And guess who is pictured in their advert as a graduate who is now a famous author?
Would that be Ray Bradbury?
No, it's none other than A.E. Van Vogt, the author of Slan. So how remarkable is that there's a full-page ad for his novel, and there he is also being touted as being somebody who has learned through this Palmer Institute of Authorship. And then we get to a story called Pillar to Post by John Wyndham, and I think this is the last story in the magazine. John Wyndham had been around for decades, mostly writing under various pseudonyms, which were variations of his real name, John Bain Harris, and various other variations. And at some point he switched to just calling himself John Wyndham, and that seems to have coincided with his period in the 1950s where he was writing the novels which we now see as his classics. So Day of the Triffids, The Midwich Cuckoos. This story is really from the beginning of that era, the 1950s John Wyndham era. And this is a short story set in the US. So although he's a British author, he's still writing in an American idiom at this point. What did you make of Pillar to Post?
It certainly had some interesting ideas.
You sound very diplomatic there.
Yeah, I don't think it's a great story. I love the framing narrative. I love the ending where people are like, well, he certainly seems to be who he claims that he is, but this cannot be. The premise of the story is that there's a man who is addicted to drugs because he has lost his foot, and he's in a hospital, and he goes to sleep, and he wakes up in someone else's body thousands of years in the future. And in the future, human beings have invented a form of longevity by transferring their consciousness from their current decaying body, which happens at about my age, apparently, 50s, to newer, younger ones, because many humans that are born have lost what they call the spark. They're simply animals. And then there's a discussion about whether that's right to take over someone else's younger body, and I was a little offended by that. It reminded me of several Star Trek episodes, the discussion of the value of human life. I think that was a barrier for me to get into.
Yeah, I similarly had problems with it. It felt very much like a first draft of a story to me. Again, full of ideas, but it didn't feel terribly coherent. The framing narrative does something to make it seem a more considered story than it otherwise would appear, I think. But the basic premise of sort of taking over a different physical body seems to be a standard science fiction trope, and as you say, we've seen that certainly in Star Trek a number of times. But it kind of dates itself through the language that's used. So, for example, they talk about the feeble-minded. They talk about the future of the human race. And one of the characters, the female character from the far future, talks about the other end of the human race. So she says, you're from one end of the human race, i.e. the beginning, the early days. We are from the other end of the human race. And all of our offspring are, and the word they use is feeble-minded. And that term keeps being used. Now, presumably that was a very common term. And they talk about immortality, as you say, but they say, oh no, it's not immortality, it's prolongation.
Right.
So we're not trying to live forever, we're just trying to prolong life. In a way, that seems a bit more practical than trying to achieve immortality, but it also seems rather unprincipled. At least in stories about immortality, people have this principled desire to live forever. Here, this is, I'll do whatever I can just to survive a bit longer by exploiting others.
Right.
An interesting point. Again, I keep coming back to these references to the atom and atom bombs and all of that. There was some suggestion in this story that the discovery of fission marks some kind of fundamental boundary, because they talk about this character who goes back into the past to look for bodies to inhabit. But there's a kind of a boundary that when humans discovered fission, you don't really want to go back earlier than that, because I'm not quite sure what the risk was, but it feels like, well, you don't want to go back too far because people are too primitive then. So you only want to go back as far as the discovery of fission. So it feels as if the author and people of the time were seeing the atomic bomb and the discovery of atomic energy as being this dividing line between our ancient past and our modern now. And that future lady, whose name I cannot pronounce, she says, you developed science without developing philosophy. And it's a little finger-wagging moment, but that to me, was an interesting bit in the story. Didn't really go anywhere, but at least it was an attempt to have a belief system in the story.
Well, and it's something that keeps coming back. In Jurassic Park, you were so busy trying to figure out how to do something, you didn't stop to consider if you should.
There's some nice stuff at the beginning of the story where he parallels it to, what was it? Oh, Kubla Khan. There's a couple of quotations from that and some echoing of ideas from that. And at that point, it feels, this is going to be a literate story. But then it just feels quite pulpy through the rest of it. So I was a bit disappointed, really. I was hoping that having a Wyndham story at the back end of the magazine was going to be a really strong finish point, but it unfortunately didn't feel that way. I find the adverts fascinating. There's one for a book called The City in the Sea by Wilson Tucker, which is described as a weird expedition through the post-atomic remnants of America. So, again, post-atomic. There's an ad for an anthology called The Outer Reaches, edited by August Derleth. Again, in terms of the history of science fiction, this is quite interesting because the 1950s saw a real burgeoning of anthologies being published. People looking around for the best science fiction stories and then collecting them together in different groupings, usually with a sort of a thematic grouping. And Derleth made a real industry of this. Then there comes, for me, the most fascinating ad in the whole thing, which has got nothing at all to do with science fiction. But there's an ad for the Picture Encyclopedia for Puzzle Contestants, which is described as including 24,000 pictures arranged by subject. And I really want to see this book. It just sounds quite fascinating. But it's very expensive. $11.95 is the down payment, and then you have to make 2 further easy payments. And I used an inflation calculator on the web to work out what that book would cost today. And if you plug in the amount that you would have to pay for it back in 1951, it works out as being the equivalent of $277 today for a book.
Wow. Of pictures.
Of pictures. But, they didn't have the internet then. So then there's an ad for Lifetime Chronograph wristwatch, which has an amazing feature. Do you know what the amazing feature was?
Are you talking about date changes every day?
That's it. Every day the date changes automatically. So that was amazing. That's $8.95. In today's money, that's $96. So that's, it's a decent watch you're getting there, I would imagine. And then probably the last interesting ad in the book is for Shasta Publishers' first annual science fiction novel competition. So this was an open competition that anyone could enter. You write your science fiction novel, you send it in, and you could win a $1,000 prize. And that struck me as a colossally large sum of money. And again, plugging that into the inflation calculator, $1,000 then would be worth $10,690 today. Now, if you compare that with the Writers of the Future competition, which is an ongoing competition we have nowadays for novels, the biggest prize you can get from that is $5,000. So back in the 50s, if you'd won the Shasta Publishers competition, you'd really be, you'd be quids in, as we say over here.
Quids in.
I don't know what the American equivalent is. $10,690. That's amazing. So having ploughed through the whole thing, how do you feel about 1950s Galaxy?
Like I said, I enjoyed many of the stories. And I did not expect the one about the artist and how he was losing his way of life. I guess I was expecting more aliens and time travel and not things which, impact me. So personally, yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it. I may try and do some research and see what happened to the first annual science fiction novel competition and see who won it.
Yeah, I tried to track that down. I didn't spend very much time doing it, but I did a bit of Googling and I couldn't find it. But yeah, I was quite taken with the range of ideas in the magazine. I was struck by how many references there were to uranium and post-atomic and things that I considered to be more modern, such as smoking, the idea of giving up smoking at a time when I thought everybody was smoking and wouldn't even think of giving it up. The mention of feminism, and as you say, the modernism of the artist who is displaced by a machine. So all of that feels as if it's moved on from the spaceship science fiction that was dominant in the 1940s. There are some spaceships in here, but there are very few stories that are just about space. They're nearly all about something else. And even the Jack Vance one, which is set on another planet, is actually about how two species can kind of coexist in the same space but not really appreciate each other's existence. So it's about something that is at a higher level than just travelling there in a spaceship. I think you suggested that we should do this with a modern magazine as well.
I thought it'd be an interesting contrast to take something that was made in December of 2021 and look at those stories, then contrast them versus what we just read 70 years ago.
I think it's a good idea, so perhaps we should do that for the next instalment of this very podcast. Well, dear listeners, I hope you found that interesting to romp with us through this December 1951 issue of Galaxy magazine. As I say, the full magazine is available on the Internet Archive, so we'll have a link to that on our website, which is 101sf.blogspot.com. Thanks for reading with me, Colin. This has been a very enjoyable romp, I think, and I hope you got something from it.
Oh yeah, it was fun.
Great. So thanks everyone, and we will see you in the next episode of Science Fiction 101. Thanks once again for putting up with the technical problems that we had with this recording. I hope it didn't spoil your enjoyment of episode 13 of Science Fiction 101. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Cuskey. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. Look for the show notes on our website 101sf.blogspot.com, and also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. And finally, please follow us or subscribe to us on your podcast app. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Google Podcasts, we're on Amazon Music, we're on Audible. We're wherever you get your podcasts.